Yes, it's one of the biggest differences I've seen over the last 15 plus years between top performers and average performers. And that is top performers are deathly allergic to spending too much time with a deal that has a low probability of closing.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. That was Robert Koehler. He's a leading voice in sales enablement and sales excellence through his work at HP, LinkedIn, Topo, and most recently, the real estate giant Compass. And in our conversation today, we're talking about a wide range of subjects around the topic of sales effectiveness, starting with how you measure it. We then dive into the important differences between revenue enablement and sales enablement. We get into why Robert believes sales enablement needs to focus more emphasis on the importance of understanding their business, their customers, and their buying process versus the traditional focus of learning on knowing the products in your process. And we dig into why conventional sales enablement unintentionally discourages the development of sales acumen and sellers. And we get into the difficulty behind providing more consistent levels of effective sales coaching, and why the problem is perhaps related to the fact that coaching is seen by leaders as a tool or a program, when in fact, it's actually a relationship. So we get into all of this and much, much more. But before I get to Robert, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's jump into it. Robert, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Andy. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I love your creativity and your fresh thinking.
Oh, Robert, well, thank you. It's always fun to chat with you, and I consider you one of the sort of fellow thinkers in this business, of which there need to be more, quite honestly. Because otherwise, how are we gonna evolve and improve?
Exactly.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, as you point out, it's not about necessarily finding the next great idea. It's about executing. Because the longer I've been in this business, like you have, the more I find that we still have a lot of the same root cause issues happening in sales enablement, and other areas. Yes. I mean, I get asked all the time by people, so, you've had this podcast for a long time now. What have you learned? What's really changed? And I tell people, I think what's more significant is how much it stays the same. I mean, yes, the externalities changed. We've a lot more data available to us, a lot more technologies available to help us take certain actions, but it's still people selling to people. Exactly.
Well, so before we get started in our conversation, tell us a bit about you and what you do.
Andy, my background is in sales enablement, customer success, and what I call revenue enablement. And right now I am about to launch a new consulting company. And I work in sales consulting, sales enablement consulting, and with leadership programs.
Yeah. So we first met when you were back at Topo, right?
Yes.
I think that was. Yeah. So, which was sales advisory focused on primarily on startups, I think, right? In the Bay Area, and then got acquired by Gartner.
Yeah, we started out with high-tech growth startups and then expanded to other industries. And yes, I was director sales consulting there, and we met at one of the Topo sales summits and actually we're on the same panel together.
Well, I remember listening to a panel at a Topo event. It always sticks in my mind is a bunch of VP sales, CROs. At that point, it's mostly VPs. The CRO titles hadn't become so popular yet. And I just remember one guy was talking about sales management, sales leadership. I remember one of the panelists saying, we just don't do one-on-one coaching anymore. And he says, because quite frankly, it just doesn't work. First of all, there's an audible gasp from people in the audience. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, dude, you're the problem. It's not coaching, it's you. But always sort of struck me is that, this was a, fairly well-known SaaS company. And I was thinking, wow. That
Yeah, my reaction is
volumes.
wow. And when I was working at my last company to drive revenue and built the whole sales enablement machine, challenge wasn't whether we want to do one-on-one coaching. It was how do we scale it? We had so much success with the one-to-one. It's like, how do we grow this in a repeatable manner that still maintains the connection with the seller that we're trying to coach?
Well, okay. So that's a good question. So how do you? I mean, first of all, it's great that you had that problem, and we'll get back and talk about that in a second. But since you had a successful program, how do you scale it?
So here's what we learned. I haven't found the magic silver bullet. One, we realized that we needed to get some skin in the game from the frontline sales managers. We said we needed to augment them and help them and offer a program. So I hired a sales coach and built a sales coaching pillar within the sales enablement team. And we had the sales
to coach the coaches.
To start off by coaching the sellers, and then the next phase was coaching the coaches.
Got it.
We were having less success. The first approach was to go directly to the frontline sales managers, show them all the research about how much coaching helps, and they all nodded their heads and then went off their own ways. And we didn't see that much of an increase in one-to-one coaching.
Right.
Or a lot of times, as you know, coaching is confused with running the weekly pipeline or forecast meeting.
Yeah, deal coaching, right?
Yes, exactly. So first thing we did is we hired a separate person out of sales effectiveness to work with the sellers. Then we met with all the frontline.
Well, let me just interject. So you hired a person just as a coach?
Yes.
Right. I love that. So a coach who wasn't in the line of management.
Coach that wasn't in the line of management, gave them 30, 45 days where I said to them, your main mission right now is to set it up so that by day 45, when you have your coming out party, you have really established your brand and credibility with sales management, both frontline sales managers, regional directors, CSO, and CRO.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Cool.
And then number two, I got buy-in from the CRO to ask the frontline sales managers to submit like 3/4 of a page application for which sellers they wanted to participate in the program.
Mm-hmm.
The goal was not to bury them in paperwork, Andy. The goal was for them to have some skin in the game.
Right.
And to eliminate those people that we got the first couple of times where it was, I don't want to have to put them on plan. I'll use sales enablement as a core to last result and last resort and see if they can spare me that pain.
Right. Yeah. Let me fob the problem off on somebody else. Yes.
And then secondly, what we did is we tied it in with the quarterly business reviews. We oriented quarterly business reviews to a brief section on development, and we just focused on 2 specific skills and how we were going to measure them for the quarter. Mm-hmm. So the coaching wasn't, I'm going to help Andy with discovery, which can be a huge thing, or I'm going to help Andy with proposals. It's going to be, I'm going to work with Andy on asking better questions.
Right.
I'm going to work with Andy on recapping after they've gone through the discovery while still on the call with the customer. Mm-hmm. Very specific skills. And we found that we moved the needle a lot more that way. And then third, we asked the sales managers had to agree to 2 to 3 check-in meetings with the sales coach a quarter. 15 minutes at the beginning to agree on the plan, midway checkpoint, and then a final summary and conclusion.
Got it.
And what we found was that sellers that participated in the coaching program showed a 46% increase in quota achievement quarter over quarter, and probably even more significant to me, an 11% increase in win rate quarter over quarter.
Interesting. But it wasn't that high of a touch of a coaching program, at least based on what you're saying, right?
The touches were with the sales coach prepping for the next meeting, listening in on a call, and then having, setting up the 30-minute coaching call or debrief off of the shadow.
Yeah. So the people that were achieving the higher, let's say, higher win rates, I mean, how many, let's say during a quarter, how many, because you'd mentioned the number 3 before, but how many on average coaching sessions do you think they went through during a quarter?
We started with more than 4, and we whittled it down to try to get to 3. Because what we found is once you get to 6, 7, 8, it becomes the law of diminishing marginal utility.
Right.
Particularly if we're just focused on 2 specific skills.
Right.
Versus boiling the ocean.
Which I think is for something that's more sort of execution oriented. That's fascinating. I mean, I think it's a great data point for people to think about. If you have during a quarter, let's say 1 a month, but it's really effective, right? As opposed to, boiling the ocean. We're going to talk about a lot of different things, but we're very focused on these 2 things. Yeah, I love that.
And then where we ended up going is I was transitioning into a different team is the sales leadership essentially came back to us and said, more of that, please.
Right.
Because we were able to communicate the results in a very quantifiable manner.
Right.
And they got to, with the 3 regional directors, they each had a sales coach from sales enablement working with them so that they could get in tune with exactly, the different modus operandi and philosophy of the different regional directors.
Got it. I liked it. So you had worked, and I've seen more people sort of in this area, sort of sales excellence or sales effectiveness. So you're seeing companies have this, sales effectiveness teams. So what's the role of those teams? Or I was just talking to somebody earlier this week as worked within a sales center of excellence for their employer. So what typically are the role of those teams?
So I'll give you the perspective of how I set it up, and my point of view on what's the best way to think about it, or one way to think about it.
Right.
And when I came in, the CRO hired me and said, all right, I want you to build an operation that's going to support our growth. We're going to triple or quadruple. And we did. We went from over 800 million to 3.2 billion in 3.5 years.
Right.
He said, I want you to build it and you decide what to name it and what you want to call yourself. And so I chose sales effectiveness. And some people might say, all right, well, that's the same thing as sales enablement. The small difference, which can become a big difference, if you think of, like a rocket trajectory and you're 1 millimeter off, it becomes thousands of miles.
Yeah, you go to Venus instead of Mars. Yes. Yeah.
It's not about education or enablement. And I like to say, I don't care about education or enablement. I do. But just for dramatic purposes, what I care about is results and helping sellers be more effective in helping buyers.
Right.
And that's what it's about at the end of the day. That has an implication for, all right, then we have to get sharper on what we measure, how we measure it, what we communicate. That means we really need to understand where they need to be more effective. And we're focused on performance rather than just knowledge.
Yeah. No, I like that. Well, and so it reminds me of sort of this story I was reading not too long ago about sort of a different take on performance but I think along the same lines. It was interviewing a coach of a soccer team in Norway, and listeners indulge me because I give a lot of soccer stories. But it was this small club, professional club in Norway that punches far above its weight. It's one of the top teams perennially in Norway, and it's in a small town north of the Arctic Circle, right? And but then they always compete in the main competition in Europe, the big European wide competition like the Champions League or the Europa League. And this was an interview with the coach about, well, how do you achieve at this level, sort of year after year? He said, well, the secret is we focus on performance, not results. And I think that sort of aligns with what you're just saying is we focus on the effectiveness of what we do, knowing the results will come. And I think that is really a critical thing for sellers, is to be less concerned about the outcome and more about, okay, what am I doing in this moment that's helping move the ball forward?
Yes, because if you do the right things in practice and study, you're going to get the result. It's like when I was coaching marathon runners, everybody has different styles of running.
Didn't know you did that.
Yes, I did that. I mentored well over 100 marathon runners.
Wow.
People that were trying to run their first time marathon for Leukemia Society team in training.
Got it. Yeah. I see those people out running all the time. Like once I remember my wife and I were out for a run on the beach near Santa Monica in LA, and there were whole groups of team in training for the leukemia fundraising for, I think, the LA Marathon. Yeah, it's really, really cool.
Yeah, it was a great program. And, a lot of newcomers come and say, well, how am I going to do this if I'm not running 26.2 miles in practice? Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit of trust us. We've done this several times before. And specifically, if you do these things, the short runs, a little bit of track work, longer runs on the weekends and so forth, you will get the result.
Yeah. Well, also, it's great to be in a group too. I think that I always like that idea, is because didn't they run with a pacer for, hey, I'm the pacer for, this, the 3-hour marathon or the whatever. I presume they broke it down by per mile pace, but
yeah. I would love to seize on that point for a minute, Andy, even though it might be a little bit of a detour.
No,
because you and I had talked about this a few months ago. And one of the things I found in building and running sales enablement, sales effectiveness organizations and driving sales results is the power of accountability groups.
Right.
And it made me think of marathon running. Because whether it's a book club or small groups in a church or marathoning, that accountability of having a running partner is so powerful. And I didn't worry about the folks that didn't show up for a lot of the midweek runs if I knew they had somebody else they were running with. Right. The people that didn't show up and didn't have an accountability partner. So what? How does that apply to what we're passionate about, the field of sales, making people more effective? I found in two of the big topics that people brought up to me lately, frontline sales management and leadership programs, that when we leveraged peer accountability groups at my last company, it was incredibly effective.
At the individual seller level as well as the management level?
Yes. And even more important and more effective in getting buy-in from frontline sales managers and senior sales leaders. Because frontline sales managers, sellers don't want to be trained, period. Frontline sales managers really don't want to be trained. And what they do want...
Well, thankfully, because they're not for the most part.
Yeah. Exactly. What they do want is they want to feel like they're getting an advanced MBA and development from their company, and they want to hear their peers. They don't want to go up and hear me talking for 2 hours. They want to know what their peers are doing, because a lot of companies, they're so busy firefighting, they don't know what some of the folks that are being really successful do. So we would pair them up in teams between sessions, and we would also, for our leadership programs, for instance, come back in the second session wouldn't be more learning and training, as we gave them one thing to practice that was really simple, that fit into the normal routine of their work. So it wasn't extra work. And we'd essentially facilitate a peer-to-peer sharing and learning session. And they found heavy value in that. And specifically, what I found with our last round leadership program is we had active participation of the entire sales leadership, senior sales leaders and frontline sales managers of 86% is where we finished. Whereas the first time we ran it without that, participation rate fell down to 54% by the end of the program.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. So I'm sort of thinking take it outside the scope of a single company is, a lot of people join, we're seeing a lot of growth of sales communities these days and so on. And in some cases, there are sort of these, peer partnerships that are formed. I think to me that would be hugely attractive, even if it wasn't somebody within my company or even my specific industry. Maybe even more impactful if they weren't.
Yeah, and even if it's a 15-minute conversation and you and I share something, one 15-minute conversation in 3 weeks, there's still value. It's, progress, not perfection.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree 100% on that. Very, very interesting. So now you brought up a term before, which, you and I have touched on in the past in our conversations, is you're saying focusing more, especially with early stage companies, on revenue enablement versus sales enablement. So tell us what you see the differences.
Okay. So first, my definition of revenue enablement is we're enabling all pre and post sales customer facing teams.
Okay.
And sales enablement is sales, SDRs, account executives, account managers, the people doing, more renewal, upsell and cross sell, whatever they may be called at different companies.
Right.
Why revenue enablement? One, that aligns better to the buyer needs and what the buyer needs.
Yep.
Because if you look at what buyers say, one, they don't want to have to keep repeating information to different groups. And
I tell you my rule of thumb about that?
Yeah.
So I teach this to sellers. I said, rule of thumb is your odds of winning a piece of business, and this is just purely on the first order, but it applies over time. Your odds of winning the business exist in inverse proportions to the number of times you ask the customer to tell you their story.
I love that.
And because you just so often, you saw this with sales teams, and I experienced it when I was early in my career, is I have a customer, a big opportunity I'm working on, and I'd bring in my immediate sales manager to meet the customer. And the first thing they do is ask them so tell us about yourself, go through your needs again. It's like, he's communicating to the buyer, we don't trust the seller, right? Because I need to hear this myself. And then you bring in the next level boss. Same thing again, right? So tell me about your needs. It's like they start over again.
Yeah, in a complex enterprise sale, they probably told their story to the SDR, the account executive's manager, the pre-sales engineer, and the post-sales customer success manager.
And the director or VP, if they get brought in, and possibly even the CEO. And it's like, first of all, hey, what do you think Salesforce is for? Are you not reading what we've put in there? But I didn't want to get sidetracked on that. But
so buyers want the different groups that they work with in a company to have some, at least, of the same general understanding of the industry, of the business, and their specific company, account, and business. Mm-hmm. What revenue enablement also does, in my mind, Andy, is it, and this is really important for startup companies, if you can think of revenue enablement first instead of sales enablement, you're immediately eliminating some of the redundancy and skills and tools training. You're eliminating creating different technology and terminology silos. And I'll give you a more specific example,
Sure.
related to some of the things I work on. Right now, I'm doing a buyer persona framework, what I call sales-centric buyer personas. Buyer messaging, storytelling, objection handling. Is there a difference in the framework of that between what you want a customer success manager to know and an account executive to know? In my mind, no.
No. Yeah.
The only difference is maybe some of the nuance of the content that we put into the framework,
Right.
and how deeply you apply it. So when I was at my last company, I had built up the whole sales effectiveness team. Then they asked me to move over and start up the whole customer success effectiveness team, which had over impacted 900 internal employees. And we were recreating the wheel. They brought me over and said, "We want you to rinse and repeat." And they had different terminology, different technology systems, different views on buyer needs over on the customer success or operational side.
Right.
Now, it's harder with a company that's more mature, that has already built those different organizations. I'm not saying it's going to be simple to merge them all into one revenue enablement team, but maybe a small win is if I do a leadership program, I don't just apply it to sales leaders. I also apply it to the customer success leaders, the pre-sales engineer leaders, so on and so forth.
Right.
The last point I'll make, if to get a little esoteric for about 60 seconds, is something I'm fascinated by called Conway's Law. And it says an organization's output is directly related to how it communicates internally. And so what typically happens is you have customer success has their own language, their own terminology, as does pre-sales, as does the SDR team, as does the AE team, when the customer just wants one experience.
Right.
And the most notable application of Conway's Law was this museum, the Australia Centre for Moving Images. And they had all these different departments related to different exhibits, and one for technology and one for customer experience. And what they said is, let's scrap that and try to think of it all together, just one experience of walking through one museum. And they got everybody communicating as one group. And the museum revenue and visitation went up like 25%.
It seems so intuitively obvious, right? But yeah. Well, I mean, I liked what you said before about you're trying to align the view of the buyer, or the view that sales has of the buyer and their needs and requirements, with the view that success has of the buyer and their needs and requirements.
And in terms of the economics of the business, if you can build that from the get-go, you're now going to lower your cost of sale, whether pre-sale or post-sale, because you're not going to need to invest in, you're not going to have two different technology systems to solve the same problem. You don't necessarily need as many layers of different types of management.
Right. Well, you also have a single source of truth that you're dealing from, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can get them all in the same content management system,
for instance, right?
Yeah, and that can be a huge challenge for companies.
Well, and this translates into, you touched on it, how do we onboard people, right? Because if that's really our focus, or one of our focuses, then the way we're typically onboarding and enabling new sellers doesn't really address that.
No, and onboarding to me begins with the buyer, meaning the first module or first topic that I want to get across in onboarding is understanding the buyer. And there's a couple of different, sub modules of that. And everybody needs to understand the buyer. I want the people in customer support to have an understanding of the buyer. Mm-hmm. The customer success, to pre-sales, to sales, and yet they all get different onboarding programs. And what is onboarding? What is it traditionally started with? Our products and solutions.
Right. Oh, 100%, right?
Yeah, and then the founder or senior leader goes out in the field and is perplexed as to why we're selling product, feature, functions.
Well, and the fact is, that's not why people are making their decisions. So, I mean, in my mind, the data that I see is and I talk about is buyers aren't driven by product, feature, functions, and primarily in making their decisions about what to buy. I mean, there's data we've been sharing recently that was gathered by a company called Trinity Perspectives out of Australia, done win-loss analyses, and face-to-face interviews with well over 1,000 enterprise buyers, B2B buyers, and decision makers, and they've sort of summarized it into, hey, here are the 9, as a result of all these interviews and all this data gathering, the 9 primary reasons why you win, 9 primary reasons why you lose. Not one of the 9 why you win or 9 reasons why you lose have to do with the product. This is coming from the buyers and the decision makers.
It's the old adage of people use logic to justify emotional decisions. And to put it in an even better context, I love the emphasis on your latest book, Andy, and you talk about human connection. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a big part of it. I mean, you mentioned connection, curiosity, understanding, and generosity, but big, bold highlight around the word connection, human connection.
Well, it starts there. Right? That's the foundation for everything that follows in terms of building credibility and trust and influence. And one of the 9 most commonly cited reasons why vendors lose deals, as reported, I said, 1,000+ data points, was failure to make an emotional connection.
Absolutely.
Right there. One of the primary things. And there's all these doubters out there that, I've had some of these people on the show, I think, and I saw a LinkedIn post about this, just a couple weeks ago or 3 weeks ago at this point. Some relatively, well-followed person on LinkedIn saying, buyers don't want human connection. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. I mean, first of all, for this person, he was conflating a connection with a friendship. And as long as people are being so blind in how they conceptualize what the connection means and the value of the connection, it's going to be problematic. So we're talking about just humans connect. There's this level of connection. And if you're connected, yes, it's a form of a relationship. That's true. But it's the conduit for creating a level of trust that enables everything that needs to follow it. If you're doing inadequate discovery, and you find that's one of the sort of weak points in your process, and you're doing some, again, win-loss analyses, and it's because you didn't build the trust to a sufficient level to be able to ask the questions and get the answers that you needed.
Yes. And, part of that trust is just being comfortable talking to them human to human. Part of that trust is understanding their business, understanding what they do. And an area that doesn't get much attention is understanding the economics of their business when they may not.
Well, or to at least be able to ask questions to help them understand.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that is one of the reasons why buyers not necessarily want to talk to sellers, but need to talk to sellers, is they need somebody that can ask them questions they're not thinking to ask themselves.
Yeah.
And that's why the self-aware buyer does talk to sellers. Otherwise, they do it all on their own.
Yeah, you said it to me, and it stuck with me. Is buyers don't want to buy product; they want ideas, and
Yeah.
I think that's why what they only spend 17% of the evaluation time, according to Gartner, talking to sellers. I think in that
Can we
whatever
talk?
that
Can we talk about that figure?
yeah, yeah. Yes,
Because what's missing from that figure is a couple things. One is, okay, buyers only said 70. I'm willing to bet that the number is actually much lower. And that's okay. Because, and A is, I don't think it's ever been any different. I mean, there's an implication where they say only 17%, and there's always sort of the sky is falling aspect to it. It's like, yeah, so? That was my first reaction to it. I was like, so? I mean, that's a lot higher than I would have expected. I mean, think about it. I mean, I spent a good chunk of my career selling to customers outside the United States, doing most of it, sort of unfortunately dating myself, but pre-email, doing a lot on the phone, certainly, pre-video conferencing. And we were selling, 7-8 figure deals. I'd see the customer, I don't know, if I was lucky, I'd see them 4 times before they signed an order. I would imagine there was maybe 3 vendors they were talking to. If they spent 17%, that would have been a lot.
and I love that comment because I had, let's say it's 3 or 5%, or I said it puts even more emphasis on you have very limited time.
Yes.
To share some ideas, to ask some good questions, and to connect with them.
Yes. I mean, which means you have to bring your A game every time you have the opportunity to interact with the buyer. And this idea I talk about in the book about, you have to be intentional, right? Every time you interact with a buyer, it has to be justified. That's the term I've been using recently. It has to be justified. How are you justifying this interaction with the buyer? Is it, whether it's an email, a voicemail, in-person meeting, face-to-face meeting online, or actual in-person meeting, how are you justifying it? Meaning, the buyer's going to invest some time and attention in you. What are they getting out of it that's going to help them make progress toward making a decision?
Yeah. And I love the word you used, intentional. So my last company, I talked a lot about that with sellers in general, and also when I was doing one-on-one or small group coaching. Mm-hmm. And the simple exercise of asking them, okay, share with me the purpose, agenda, and outcome of this upcoming meeting.
Yes.
I could tell most of the time the way they shared the outcome, how effective the meeting was going to be. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, how intentional they were. There were a lot of fuzzy objectives, and there wasn't, the more intentional you are, the more you have an idea of what you want to achieve. And I also want to mention one other thing in case there's people like me listening out there. Because when I started my sales career, I was so focused on being intentional and getting to the point that I didn't make any time for idle chit chat. I'm a businessman. I'm a serious guy. When I went to the next level in sales, I just became more comfortable with myself as a human being, had more life experience. It's like, hey, I'm going to have some fun, right? Because life is short, and I'm going to talk to these people. Just like I'm meeting a new person. Yeah, I had some intention behind that. It wasn't, what's your favorite hobby? And, if I caught you on Saturday night, what would you be eating? But it was just letting the conversation go for a few minutes and talking to them.
Yeah. I mean, I agree, as you probably expect, 1,000% on that. And I talk about in my book, Sell Without Selling Out, 2 questions that managers should be able to ask about every opportunity in a pipeline, and the 2 questions that a seller should be able to answer about every opportunity in their pipeline, which is, in this next interaction you're going to have with the buyer, What are they expecting from us that's going to help them make progress toward making a decision? And as a result of receiving that value from us, what steps are they going to commit to take? It's that simple. If you can't answer those questions, don't waste the buyer's time, right? Because they've got a limited pool of time and attention to invest in this whole project of making a decision. Don't waste it. And similarly, don't waste your own time and attention as a seller, because you also have a very limited inventory of hours that you can spend and invest.
Absolutely.
So in the absence of an answer to those questions, I coach sellers as well. Do nothing. Don't send that check-in email. Don't send something that has no value for them. Just because you think, it's time to touch bases with them, it's time to make sure establish another connection point or something. No, you got to be much more intentional than that.
Andy, I can't call you just to check in.
Not when I'm buying something, but otherwise, you can call me anytime. But
I appreciate your emphasis on the idea of decision making, because I think it's in spirit with what you've always said. We're not here, you say in your book, it's about influence, not persuasion. We're not trying to manipulate the customer.
Right.
And I've adopted and prefer to think about it the way you phrase it, of we're here to help them make a decision, a good decision, which
they're hiring us to do that.
Yes.
I mean, that's really the thing, the perspective, I want sellers to think about it and sales leaders is the buyer has a job that needs to be done, which is to make a decision about making a change in some dimension. The fact they're talking to you means that they need your help. They're hiring you to help them make that decision.
Yes. Which is, as an aside, a whole separate topic for another podcast, but why I think there needs to be more emphasis in sales and sales enablement around studying decision making, because in my mind, that's what we're doing.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
There's a lot out there in the fields of neuropsychology and behavioral economics about decision making that we can leverage.
Absolutely. I mean, I would start onboarding program, as you talked about before. I would start with something along the lines of why they buy. What triggers customers' decision making, and to your point, there's a lot that's been written about that. I write about it in this book as well. The final chapter of my book, I put forth what I believe happens, and based on research done by Nobel Prize winning economist and psychologist, excuse me. But there's a lot of information out there. So we should be providing this context to sellers just to start with is, how do people make decisions? What triggers decisions? What are the motivations that drive people to make decisions? And then get the feedback. The second part should be, okay, now this is the feedback from our actual buyers, our customers, right? What is the thing that they need from us as sellers to help them get that job done?
Yes.
And this is something that I've been on my soapbox more about recently, but we know from Challenger, we know from Forrester, other analyst firms have talked about this, is that thing in Challenger, they talk about 53% of the buying decisions based on the buyer's experience with the individual seller. I think that this has actually become more pronounced, not less, as more products, certainly in the software world, become and not just software world, but almost in every market, it's become more similar in the minds of the buyer. And looking at this research, so I cited earlier from Trinity Perspectives, that when people are making decisions about buying, it's not about the product, it's not about the features. That doesn't even come up in their top 9 reasons why they're buying. It's about the experience of buying, the experience working with the seller. And so don't we want to know what the buyer needs from the seller in order to help them make a decision?
Yes, which is why, we call it sales process, that should really align and start with what's the stage of the buyer decision-making process and what do they need. And I wanted to comment on two other things, circle back to what you said when you're talking about the two questions that they should be able to answer.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about actions on behalf of the buyer, and that lends itself to, I'm going to use a wonkish term so you may cringe, exit criteria. And that I think good processes for helping sellers now involve exit criteria, which are based on actions on both the part of the buyer and the seller. Because I see so many opportunities where we delude ourselves about where it is and how winnable it is because we've done a certain activity. We conducted the demo and they agreed to another meeting. We've done discovery and they talked for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But they didn't do a tangible, verifiable action where we just look at ourselves and not the buyer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I prefer a different term, which I prefer milestones.
Okay.
And the reason being is, I'm still a little skittish because, a lot of people use the word exit criteria and they talk about, okay, we've got this linear stage-based selling process. We interact, we do preliminary discovery, we do a demo, we do detailed discovery, we do qualification. Each of those stages has exit criteria, which gives the idea that somehow it's done. And, just take discovery as a perfect example. Discovery is never done. Yet, there's lots of people out there talking about, well, here are the exit criteria for our discovery stage. It's like, no, that may be a milestone on the road to making a decision. But if you're telling people it's exit criteria for discovery stage, they're going to stop asking questions. They're going to turn off their curiosity when actually that's when you really need to double down on your curiosity.
Yes. And it's not ABC, always be closing. It's always be discovering.
Yeah. Well, I like to say this, that every interaction you have with a buyer sort of has four goals. I call it. There's probably more, but you deepen your connection, you deepen your discovery, you deepen your understanding, and you deepen the value that you're providing to help them make a decision. That should be a goal of every interaction. 4 goals of every interaction. So if you put an endpoint on discovery, then people don't attempt to learn more. And I've learned things, and most sellers do, is you may learn things just when you think you're getting ready to close that's, hey, make a difference.
And when I watch top performers, because I was thinking as you were just commenting, Andy, when I watch top performers, they're always asking questions throughout the process. In other words, reconfirming their understanding with the assumption that they may have missed something or not understood something.
Yeah. Or as I wrote about in the book, is when you think you've confirmed exactly what the buyer has told you and you're confirming your understanding, the question you want to ask at that point is, great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, for confirming that. So what are we missing? What are we missing? Ask that a few times, right? Just when you think, and the buyer thinks, maybe we've got this, tied up in a pretty package with a bow. But what are we missing? And this then triggers deeper thought, right, on everybody's part. Oh, well, it's interesting. Yeah. Oh, maybe we didn't get Jennifer's perspective from this department, or maybe maybe we had this question. We didn't really nail that down. And if you surface that, hey, everybody else is just your competitors. They're marching forward. They think they've got it all done. No, you're finding out something more that gives you an advantage going forward.
I like that. And there's another question that I love that more experienced CROs and VPs of sales ask internally, which relates to the concept of opportunity cost that you raised. Mm-hmm. And that is, why are we going to lose this deal? Mm-hmm. Because I find that's the best anecdote or vaccination for happy ears.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's interesting. Yeah, frame it as why are we going to lose this deal? Yeah. No, I like that. I like that.
Yeah, I had a VP in San Mateo, California, worked at Oracle for many years, and we were talking about an opportunity deal review framework. And he finally said, all right, stop. Said all these questions are just leading right down the primrose path. It's like, Robert, I've been doing this for a long time, and I only ask two questions. And here's one of them, because I am so tired of the line of sellers outside my door in the last 2 weeks every quarter coming into my office and giving me 17 reasons why we're going to win the deal. He said, so I flipped it on its head.
Right.
And generally, the first or second question I ask is, tell me why we're going to lose the deal.
Well, I like it. I like it. I like that. Yeah, I mean, it forces you to sort of come down off the high of thinking you're going to win it and be really realistic about, okay, where do we stand on the buyer's estimation?
Yeah.
And this is something that leads to another point, which again is coach on, but we need to train on and onboard on, because I think that's a great question for sellers to be asking themselves. But paired with that is this reluctance on the part of sellers to ask, so where do we stand? Right? Where do we stand relative to the competition at this point in time? Where are we in your estimation at this point in time? Basically saying, hey, how are we doing?
I have found that to be a great tip. And I shared this with you when I sent you a note when I first looked at your book. I think that's just a great question for any relationship that you're in.
Yes.
You know, it depends on the relationship, of course. But I have found that I am not a great mind reader, despite my perception that I was ready to get a crystal ball and make a lot of money doing fortune telling.
Yeah.
So, let's check in. Where do we stand? What do you think of what I just said? How are we doing?
Yeah. So you finish a call. You finish a call. So was this helpful? Did we meet the objectives that you had in mind for this call? I mean, it's along the same lines. Is continually take the pulse of how you're doing. Why leave it to be a mystery? Right? If you're thinking, well, geez, how am I forecasting the opportunities are going to close? If you're not at this level of understanding of the buyer's perspective of how you're doing, how are you making that call?
Yeah, it's like a nurse walking out of the hospital room going, I hope Andy's blood pressure is good.
Well, pretty much, right? Is we're operating on a level of assumption. And it boils down to fear, right? Is people don't want to ask because they don't want to know, right? Because they're thinking at one level, man, it's probably not good, but I'm building momentum, right? And that's just the wrong approach for sellers to take. Is always ask, find out where you stand in relation to things. What's the worst they're going to say? Give you the truth? You're not doing well? Well, then you've got information that you can act on and try to change things. Or maybe make a decision to say, yeah, this is not really a fit for us.
Yeah, information is power.
Yeah.
I don't even like the word power. It's just if I have the information, I can have a more resourced response.
Yeah, well, I can make a decision, right? Because again, as a seller, you have to make the biggest decision you have to make is where you're going to allocate your time, how you're going to spend your time. You've got a limited amount of time. And your ideal state should be is how can I be as effective as possible with every minute I have with a buyer. And that was really sort of the genesis for the name of my first book, which had Zero Time Selling, which actually came from a client who, we're talking about this idea of continuous improvement in our ability to be effective in front of buyers. And I just sort of, drew out this hypothetical drawing for him that, theoretically, if we kept getting more and more effective, that we could move people through their buying process in zero time, right? I mean, theoretically, right? You could get infinitely improved. But Yeah, that was sort of he had given it that term, but that's sort of the idea. So how do you get better unless you're asking? I mean, certainly your win rate and results will talk, but that's at one level. But to really understand, you have to go back and ask.
Yes, and that also relates to the one of the great pandemics I still see out there in the sales world and the leadership world, for that matter, is time management.
Yes,
and we can say it, and sellers may roll their eyes that time is the most valuable asset that you can control, and yet, when I get into deals or quarterly business reviews with sellers, and we get into this concept of, is this the right place to invest this limited resource? They don't apply that concept of time being the most valuable asset they control in real life action.
Well, and we see this in spades in the low win rates in many companies, right? And you and I have talked about this in the past, is you're spending time selling to someone that you have no realistic chance of winning for whatever reason. We won't even dive into the reasons. And part of the reason may be that you're not spending enough time with them to really understand the things that are most important that are driving the decision, because you've got too many opportunities you're working on. But yeah, that you have to make a choice as a seller. And in my first book, I use this image of saying, look, you really need to think about yourself sort of as the bouncer at the end of the velvet line getting into an exclusive club. Is you decide who gets into the club, that club being who you're going to sell to. Just because somebody raised their hand and said we might be interested doesn't mean they get in the club. And you as a seller have to make a decision about, qualification, if it's the ICP, just some initial screening. But then even as you go through into the deal, just because you started down the path doesn't mean you finish the path. Sometimes they're just not a fit. And you have to say, this is to yourself first. This is not a fit. And no matter how much I might wish it is, it's just not going to be. The odds of winning are extremely low. There are companies that are better suited for it. Just say thank you and say goodbye.
Yes, it's one of the biggest differences I've seen over the last 15 plus years between top performers and average performers. And that is, top performers are deathly allergic to spending too much time with a deal that has a low probability of closing.
Yes. Well, and that's an important distinction to make. Low probability of closing versus low probability of winning. Because, the worst of all possible outcomes, to me, on record with this, is a no decision. Right?
Yes, and that's often the biggest competitor we lose to.
Right. But I'd rather lose, which means at least I did my job. We got the customer point where they made a decision, right? We competed. We're not going to win every deal, but we competed. We competed well. We could do a debrief after and make a decision about whether we should have competed on it. But if we competed well, we thought we were in a fair hearing, we thought we were in the running. Sure, we lost. But boy, to go through the whole process and have the customer say, we're just going to stay where we are. I mean, it wasn't just a failure on your part, a failure on all the other sellers' parts that you're competing against as well. Everybody did a pretty bad job.
Yeah, we did something really interesting at my last company, and that was we really focused sellers on something called the power position. Maybe the wrong branding, but if you'll excuse that for a minute, it was this notion that we are equals in a relationship.
Yes.
And the way you introduce and finish the call is all based on the idea of, hey, we're going to make, this is about both of us making a mutually beneficial decision.
Right. Right.
And that sounds simple, but we required people to do it on a 2-minute meeting introduction video practice. Mm-hmm. And one of the 4 elements we were checking for was the power position. People need to practice it because it's related to the mindset of, I need you to buy from me, Andy, please.
Right.
Now I've got to hit my quota or whatever the thoughts are, or I've only been at this 6 weeks and you've been in the industry for 10 years. You're so much more knowledgeable than I am. How am I going to sell to you? No, it's two people deciding, hey, we're on equal footing. You got to have that mentality and you need to introduce it to the customer that way.
I agree. I mean, for me, this goes back further in life. I mean, I was very fortunate. You know, my parents used to say when we were kids, parents loved to dress us up and, you know, have us come to their parties they would throw and so on. And you always used to think, oh, they're showing us off, right? And that used to be annoying. But then as I got older, I began to understand a bit older was like, oh, actually what they were doing, whether it's intentional or not, this is sort of the net result of it, is that what our parents are really proud of is that we as kids could hold conversations with adults, meaning with people where there's this incredible status mismatch between the two.
Yeah. Yes.
And it became something that, you know, carried over into later life, is this ability to hold a conversation with people where ostensibly there's a status mismatch, but to talk as equals. And it's a very important, you know, mindset to have. I'm glad you brought it up because, I like to joke when people say, you know, what's the cause of bad selling? I got to say bad parenting, but it's helping, you know, people from even young ages to have this, feel comfortable talking to people and holding conversations with people that, again, on the surface are different levels. And for me, this was hugely valuable as I got into my career. It's not that I didn't want to sell. It's not that I wasn't anxious to get business, but I could go in as, you know, a young salesperson, looked really young. My first job, I looked like a teenager, and hold conversations with founders of companies and CEOs and have them give me time. And I got much better obviously as time went by, but at least initially I was curious and I could hold a conversation and I wasn't, outwardly just grasping for something, right? I was interested in the person. I knew how to have a conversation. I have shown interest in the other person to open the door to a conversation. So, I think it's a really valuable perspective to have.
Yes. I hope you're going to give the 800 number for your parenting manual at the end of this call.
Yeah. Let's ask my kids about that. But
it reminds me of the course I took at Stanford in improv. And there's a famous improv exercise where it's all about status mismatch,
right?
And how that impacts things. And I think that's happens a lot in sales. But they assign people a number from 1 to 4. 1 is the biggest authority figure, and they go out bossing everybody around. The 4 has to do whatever somebody asks them to, and you give all the players numbers, but they can't share what their number is. And the audience, the rest of us in the class would have to guess who was a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. And then you do an exercise where you try to balance out the status better.
Yeah. I mean, I remember too. Excuse me. I remember a friend in the sales business, fellow author I'd met, Robert Turson. I don't know if you're Robert, but I'm not sure how active he is anymore. But is a little bit older. But he said that was always the secret to his success, and he had been very successful an entrepreneur, and the businesses he had run is, he said, everybody was my equal. Right? They weren't above me, they weren't below me. Everybody was my equal. And it's such a great perspective, I think, for young sellers as well, is to understand is you're not asking people for a favor when you're selling to them, is you're there to provide a service, and they may choose not to avail themselves of that service, but you're there on an equal footing. And All right, Robert, great stuff. Unfortunately, got to cut things a little short, even though we've gone quite a long time. But it was great. So thank you very much. And if people want to connect with you and learn about your new business, what's the best way to do that?
Best way to do that is you can go to my LinkedIn profile, Robert Koehler, Koehler, or you can email me. About to put up the site and my business email. But for right now, it's Robert Koehler, Koehler, one word, 066. So it's no dots. Robert Koehler, 066 @gmail.com.
Perfect. All right, Robert. Thank you. I look forward to doing it again.
All right. Thank you so much, Andy. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank our guest, Robert Koehler, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So thank you for your help with that. And as always, thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.